Okay, now we are on the second piece of the joint lecture. We already talked about the different ways to classify joints, and now we're going to talk about ways that those joints can move. And as we go along, I'll be talking about some specific joints as an example. Before we begin, I wanted to point out that usually the terms, those action terms, come in some sort of pair, and I think that might be helpful for you because it'll help link information together, which will make it easier to remember. So think of them as sort of pair, group them together, chunk them together. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is flexion and extension. Now these are opposite to each other, and so what flexion means is you're going to decrease the angle at a joint, right? So here's your joint, your elbow joint there, and if you decrease the angle here, that is going to be flexion. So flex the arm right there, right? So again, it's not flex. People talk about the word flex as if like you always flex your muscles, but as we're about to see, sometimes when your muscles flex, what you're actually doing is extension, right? So you have flexion, which should be decreasing the angle. So I could say I flexed my arm or I flexed my elbow. Either way you can say that. But then you also have another muscle that would do extension. And extension means to increase the angle at a joint. So if it's going towards this way, that would be flexion. And going the other direction where you're increasing the angle at that joint, that would be extension. Okay, so for example, on here, if you are flexing it, so decreasing this angle here, that is flexion. Increasing the angle, that is extension. Extension of the wrist or extension of the hand. Okay, so those are opposites, but you can group them together. Remember that they come in opposing pairs. So let's test it. So if I were standing here and I look down, okay, what did I do to the angle there? Okay, so the angle from here to here has decreased, and so this would be an example of flexion. So you could say that he flexed his head or he had flexion of the spine. Okay, next group that we're going to look at is abduction and adduction. Now be very careful with these. They only differ by one letter, okay? So be very careful. So abduction means that you take away from the midline. So if you pretend that there's a midline running down the middle of your body and you're going away from the midline, okay, so putting the arms up in this case, that would be abduction. And the way I remember it is like, it's like you're abducted, right? Get taken away. That's abduction. Whereas if you add it on, going towards the midline, that is adduction. And the way I like to think of it is you're adding it back to the body, right? So it's like addition. You're adding it back onto the main part of the body. So away would be abduction, towards would be adduction. You can also use these terms when, for example, you're talking about what your fingers would do, right? So this would be abduction. So if you pretend there's a midline there, going away from the midline, that would be abduction, or going towards the midline, that would be adduction. So abducted away, adduction, adding onto. Okay, and again, those are opposite pairs together. They do opposing actions. Okay, let's test this out. Now this one is a bit tricky. Your hint is to remember the anatomical position. Okay, so remember anatomical position means your hands are down by your side with the thumbs out. So if the thumbs are out and you're moving it like this, what are you doing? You're moving it like this towards the midline. So that would be, towards the pinky part, that would be wrist adduction. What if I would say you're going the other way, right? If you're going towards the thumb, so away from the midline, that would be wrist abduction. So abduct, adduction. Okay, so let's look at a couple of specific joints that allow this to happen. These are synovial joints, and these are called plane joints. So in your wrist, you have a bunch of small little short bones. Those are collectively called carpals, and those carpals have the ability to glide past one another. Okay, so they can go in like multiple directions, but they're only going to glide along one plane. Okay, so those are plane joints. And as they're sliding along those flat surfaces, that's what allows you to do that wrist abduction and adduction. Okay, so those are plane joints between those carpals. Okay, next set of action terms. Now these ones are not opposite. I just grouped them together because they're similar. So the first is rotation. Rotation means the entire body part moves around one axis point. Okay, so for example, I am rotating my head. My whole face moves side to side. That's rotation. In this picture right here, what we're doing is we're rotating the entire leg. So if you look at where the knee faces, it's going to move along the whole way. Okay, so you're turning around an axis in the middle. Now, circumduction is a little bit different. Okay, so if this is rotating my arm, right? The whole arm is rotating. Circumduction means one side of the body part is staying fixed. So my whole arm is still facing the same direction, but I'm creating like a cone shape. Okay, so you might make a cone shape, but you see how the whole arm isn't rotating. This is rotation. This is circumduction. Okay, that's different. So they're not opposites, but they are similar but different. So I'm grouping them together to help you remember things. So whole body part moves for rotation, and then one end of it stays put. Okay, that brings us to the hip joint. And I like talking about the hip joint because because it is a ball and socket joint, and because it's a ball and socket joint, it's called that because it's got a bulbous head that fits into a nice little socket. So you have your ball and socket joints of your shoulder, and then the ball and socket joints of your hips, okay, where the head fits into the acetabulum. So when we look at this right here, because lots and lots of range of movement, you can do a lot of different actions with that one joint. Okay, so let's start with hip circumduction. So for hip circumduction, it means that the whole leg faces forward, right? The knee is still facing forward, but the foot is going in a circle. That's circumduction. For hip rotation, it means that you're rotating along an axis. So notice how this knee stays facing forward the whole time in this one. And in this one, the knee would be rotating up and about. That's hip rotation. Then for this one here, we have hip abduction. For abduction, remember, abduction means going away from the midline. So if we drew the midline right along here and her leg is swinging away from the midline, that would be abduction. And if it's swinging towards the midline, that would be adduction. Okay, so notice that the movements are all in the same plane, right? So they're all in that frontal plane there. Whereas hip flexion would be going forward, okay? So that the angle between her body and her leg is decreasing. This is hip flexion. And then extension would be the opposite, that would be going backwards. Okay, so if she goes from her foot sticking up to going back to standing, that would be extension. And then technically this right here, this is actually called hyperextension, beyond the kind of 90-degree plane there. Okay, so note that hip abduction off to the side, okay, side to side movements. Hip flexion would be front and back, okay, and the same goes true for the arms, right? So this would be arm abduction, adduction, flexion, extension. Okay. So let's look at some special movements. And what we mean by special is they're only pertaining to a specific body part. Let's start with the arm. So on the arm, remember that here's your humerus. This one here is the radius. There's the ulna. Remember that on the humerus, there's your capitulum. There's your trochlea. The trochlea, the olecranon of the ulna is going to rotate around the trochlea. That creates a hinge joint. But the head of the radius is going to pivot around that capitulum. Now what happens is the entire bone's not going to pivot, so it's not going to be called rotation. This part right here is just going to flip over. It's not a whole full pivot. So we need a new name for that. So what happens here is if this part stays still articulating with the capitulum and you can cross it over, that's going to be called pronation. Okay, so this action here. So this movement right here, this is flexion and extension. This comes from the interaction of the humerus with the ulna, the one on the pinky side. But this action here, okay, so notice that this is staying the same place. And this movement along right here, that comes from the radius interacting with the capitulum. Okay, so when the arm is like this, with the palm up and the two bones are parallel, that is supination. So supination. When it's rotated like this, so that the radius and the ulna are crossing each other like that, that's pronation. So rotating towards palm up, supination. Rotating towards palm down, pronation. And the way that I remember that is when you're playing pro basketball, palms down, dribbling, that's pronation. And if you're holding a can of soup, like a bowl of soup, it's supination. Got to hold that up, right? Supination. So supination, palms up, pronation, palms down, like pro basketball. Okay, so that's supination and pronation, and they're only going to occur in the forearm. That's it. That's nowhere else, right? You can't have pronation of your foot. That's not going to work. Oh, yes. Okay, so here's the trochlear notch. That's going to go on the trochlea. Here is the head. The head is going to create a pivot joint that allows for pronation and supination. Okay. Okay, so now we're talking about the foot. So on this foot here, we have two actions, and the first is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Okay, so they're both a type of flexions, but we're going to talk about where the name comes from first in a bit. So dorsi, as in dorsum, that's the top of the foot, and plantar means the bottom of the foot. Okay, so they're both a type of flexion, but what changes is from which side you're measuring the angle. Okay, so when you're looking at the angle from the bottom of the foot and you're decreasing the angle from the bottom of the foot, that's going to cause plantar flexion because the angle is going to decrease from the sole of the foot, from right here. Okay, so that's plantar flexion. Plantar flexion in layman's terms just means pointing your toes down. When you point your toes, that's plantar flexion. When you flex your foot upwards, you're going to be measuring the angle from the top of the foot, okay? And if you decrease the angle measured from the top of the foot, that's dorsiflexion. So toes down, pointing your toes down, plantar flexion. pointing them upwards, that's dorsiflexion. Okay, and it just comes from whether or not you're decreasing the angle from the bottom of the foot or from the top of the foot. So that's why they need their special name. And those actions come from a hinge joint between the tibia and the talus. So the talus has this really kind of neat little dome structure here, and it's going to fit nice and neatly on the tibia so that it's going to be able to rotate in that plane like this, just like opening and closing a door, right? So that's the hinge joint right there, from the tibia and the talus, T to T. So the other types of movements that the feet can make are inversion and eversion. So if you are inverting it means you're pointing it medially. So here's your big toe. So it points towards the inside, okay, going in. So remember, in means going inversion in. Whereas eversion, if you have an aversion to something, you turn away from it. Okay, so eversion means going laterally. So what we're talking about is rotating the edge of the foot, right? So the edge of the foot rotated in, that's inversion. The edge of the foot rotated outwards, that's eversion, going away. Now you do need to be very careful because a common type of sprain is called an inversion sprain. And this is especially common for women who wear very tall heels. Be careful on those things. And so what can happen is when you have an inversion, if it's too far, the ligaments that are going to connect the fibula to the calcaneus and the other tarsals here, that can be damaged, and that's what creates that sprain. So be careful on those things. Don't kill yourself. Okay, bye-bye.